The taxi pulled away from the airport, leaving Robert standing alone on the sidewalk outside Bangkok's international terminal. Clutching his phone with trembling fingers, the screen showed her last message, sent just 3 hours ago. At library studying for finals. Missing you so much. But the photograph his private investigator had just sent told a different story. There she was, Siriporn, wrapped around another man on a dance floor. Her mouth pressed against his ear, her hand sliding down his chest. The timestamp read 2 a.m. Bangkok time. The same night, she claimed to be buried in textbooks. He had spent 18 months and nearly $60,000 believing her lies. $60,000 that was supposed to pay for her medical school tuition, her apartment, her living expenses, while she pursued her dreams of becoming a doctor. Dreams that, he was beginning to realize, existed only in his imagination and in the carefully crafted messages she sent him every single day. Robert's hand shook as he scrolled through dozens of similar photographs. Siriporn at exclusive nightclubs, Siriporn shopping for designer clothes, Siriporn kissing strangers in hotel lobbies, all while sending him sweet messages about studying late into the night, about how grateful she was for his support, about how much she loved him and couldn't wait for him to visit Thailand so they could start their life together. Before we continue with Robert's devastating story, I want to remind you to subscribe to our channel. We share real stories like this one every week, stories that might save you from making the same mistakes. Hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to hear will shock you to your core. The story begins 2 years earlier, in the most unlikely of places. Robert Matthews, 53 years old, successful architect from Toronto, was attending a virtual conference on sustainable building design when the power went out in his home office. His wife of 24 years had died from cancer just 8 months before, and Robert was drowning in grief and loneliness. The house felt like a tomb, filled with memories of Sarah's laugh echoing through empty rooms. That night, unable to focus on work, unable to sleep, Robert found himself scrolling through social media in ways he never had before. He joined online groups, forums, anywhere he could find human connection without having to face the pitying looks of friends and neighbors who didn't know what to say to the widower next door. It was in one of these groups, a photography enthusiasts forum, where he first saw her picture. Siriporn was 26, studying medicine at a prestigious university in Bangkok. Her profile showed a young woman with kind eyes and a shy smile, wearing scrubs in what appeared to be a hospital setting. Her bio read, "Future doctor, hoping to help children in rural Thailand, working 3 jobs to pay for school." Robert hadn't intended to message her. He wasn't that kind of man, wasn't someone who sought out younger women online. But something about her earnest expression, the way she talked about her dreams of helping others, reminded him of Sarah when they first met. Sarah had been a nurse, dedicated to caring for others above all else. His first message was innocent. He commented on one of her photography posts, a stunning sunset over Bangkok's skyline. She responded warmly, thanking him for his kind words. They began talking about photography, then about their dreams, their fears, their lives. Robert found himself looking forward to her messages more than anything else in his day. Siriporn told him about growing up in a poor village outside Bangkok, about being the first in her family to attend university. She shared photos of her cramped studio apartment, textbooks stacked on a makeshift desk, instant noodles for dinner because that's all she could afford. She talked about working as a waitress between classes, sending money home to support her sick mother. Robert was captivated. Here was someone who, despite facing overwhelming challenges, maintained an optimism and determination that he found inspiring. In their late-night conversations, she would tell him about her day at the hospital, the patients she was learning to care for, the professors who challenged her to be better. More importantly, she listened to him, really listened. When Robert talked about Sarah, about the depth of his loss, Siripon didn't try to fix him or tell him to move on. She simply held space for his grief, offered comfort without judgment. She understood loss, she said. Her father had died when she was 16, leaving the family in debt and her dreams of medical school seemingly impossible. Their connection deepened over months of daily messages, video calls that stretched late into the night for him, early morning for her between classes. Robert began to feel alive again, purposeful. He was helping someone achieve their dreams, someone worthy and deserving, who reminded him of everything good about humanity. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, their relationship shifted from friendship to something deeper. Siripon began sharing more intimate details of her life. She told him about her loneliness, about how difficult it was to focus on her studies while working multiple jobs. She sent photos from her hospital rotations, always in professional settings, always surrounded by textbooks and medical equipment. Robert found himself falling in love with her mind first, then her spirit. She was everything he hadn't realized he was looking for: intelligent, compassionate, driven, grateful for every small kindness. When she told him she loved him too, that she saw a future for them together after she finished medical school, Robert felt a joy he thought he'd never experience again. But love, especially love born from loneliness and vulnerability, can make even intelligent men blind to obvious red flags. The first warning sign came disguised as a crisis. Siripon called him crying one evening, explaining that her landlord was threatening eviction because she was 3 months behind on rent. She had been too proud to ask for help before, she said, but she was desperate. Without a stable place to live, she couldn't continue her studies. Robert didn't hesitate. He wired her $2,000 that same day. The relief in her voice, the gratitude, the way she cried and told him he had saved her life, made him feel like a hero. He was providing what her father couldn't, what her circumstances had denied her. He was making a difference in the life of someone he loved. That first financial help opened floodgates that Robert didn't see until much later. There was the medical textbook emergency, books that cost $800 but were required for her final year. Then her laptop broke, and she needed $1,500 for a replacement to complete her thesis. Her mother fell ill and needed surgery, $3,000 that Siripon couldn't possibly raise on her own. Each request came with detailed explanations, receipts when possible, photos of the laptop, the books, hospital bills with her mother's name. Each payment was met with overwhelming gratitude. Intimate video calls where Siripon would cry and tell him how much she loved him, how she couldn't wait to finish school so they could be together. Robert began planning their future together. He researched the process for bringing her to Canada after graduation, looked into jobs for foreign-trained doctors, even started learning basic Thai phrases to surprise her. He bought a ring, Traditional and simple, planning to propose when he visited Bangkok for her graduation ceremony. But with each passing month, the requests became larger and more frequent. Her tuition payment was due early, and she was short $4,000. There was a summer program in rural medicine that would guarantee her a job after graduation, but it required a $5,000 deposit. Her apartment building was being renovated, and she needed to move to a safer neighborhood, which meant first and last month's rent plus security deposit. Another $3,000. Robert's savings account, built over decades of careful planning, began to drain rapidly. But every time doubt crept in, Siripon would sense his hesitation and respond with exactly what he needed to hear. She would send photos from her clinical rotations, wearing scrubs and a stethoscope, surrounded by children in a rural clinic. She would video call him from what appeared to be the hospital library, textbooks spread around her, other students visible in the background. Most convincingly, she maintained the daily routine of their relationship: good morning messages when she woke up for early classes, photos of her simple meals, her sparse apartment, her tired face after long days at the hospital, evening calls where she would share stories from her rotations, ask about his work, remember details about his life that proved she was listening, caring, invested in their relationship beyond the money. The financial requests always came with explanations that made sense, accompanied by evidence that seemed legitimate, and followed by weeks of normal conversation where money never came up. Robert began to see the payments not as charity or even as financial support for a girlfriend, but as an investment in their shared future. He was paying for her medical education, yes, but once she graduated and they were together, they would build a life that would make all of this worthwhile. By the time Robert stepped off that plane in Bangkok, he had sent Siripon nearly $60,000 over 18 months. His retirement account was decimated, his emergency fund gone, his grief counselor's warnings about rebound relationships and vulnerable emotional states dismissed as professional pessimism. He had planned this trip as a surprise. Siripon thought he was coming in 2 weeks for her graduation ceremony. But Robert wanted to surprise her, to see the life they had been building together through screens and messages, to meet the woman who had brought joy back into his world after Sarah's death. The private investigator had been his lawyer's idea. James Morton had been Robert's friend for 15 years, had handled Sarah's estate, had watched Robert give away increasing amounts of money to someone he had never met in person. James had begged Robert to verify Siripon's story before making the trip, to hire someone local who could confirm that the woman he loved was who she claimed to be. Robert had resisted at first. It felt like a betrayal, like he was investigating his own girlfriend, the woman he planned to propose to. But James had been persistent. And finally, Robert agreed to what he thought would be a simple verification process. Just confirm she was enrolled in medical school, that she lived where she said she lived, that the basic facts of her life were true. The investigator's report had arrived 3 days ago. Robert had been sitting in his hotel room in Vancouver, preparing for his flight, when the email appeared in his inbox. The subject line read, "Urgent investigation results. Please call immediately." Siripon Kantawong was indeed 26 years old. She had indeed grown up in a village outside Bangkok. But that's where the truth ended and the elaborate fiction began. She was not enrolled in any medical program at any university in Thailand. She had never been enrolled in medical school. The photographs she had sent from hospital settings were taken during brief visits to friends who actually worked there, or in public areas of hospitals that anyone could access. The scrubs could be purchased online. The textbooks were borrowed props. She did not live in the modest studio apartment she had shown him. The investigator had tracked her to an expensive high-rise condominium in Bangkok's most exclusive district, a place that would cost more per month than most Thai doctors earned in a year. But the most devastating revelation was her lifestyle. Night after night, Siriporn was photographed at Bangkok's most expensive clubs and restaurants, wearing designer clothes, jewelry worth thousands of dollars, always accompanied by different men. Foreign men mostly, middle-aged. The kind of men who might wire money to young Thai women they had never met. The investigator had been thorough. He had documented her activities for 2 weeks, tracking her daily routine. She woke up in the afternoon, spent her mornings shopping or at beauty salons, her evenings at expensive restaurants, her nights dancing at clubs that charged more for a bottle of champagne than Robert made in a day. Robert had read the report 3 times before the reality sank in. Everything was a lie. The medical school, the struggling student, the sick mother, the humble apartment, the dream of helping rural children, all of it carefully constructed fiction, designed to extract money from lonely, vulnerable men like himself. Now, standing outside Bangkok's airport, Robert had a choice to make. He could get back on a plane, fly home, chalk up the $60,000 as an expensive lesson in trust, and move on with his life. Or he could confront her, demand answers, try to understand how someone could maintain such an elaborate deception for so long. As you can probably guess, Robert chose confrontation. But before we continue, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below. Have you or anyone you know ever been deceived by someone you trusted? How far would you go to uncover the truth? Your stories help others avoid these same traps. The GPS in Robert's taxi showed they were headed to the address Siriporn had given him as her apartment. But the investigator's photos had been taken at a different location entirely. A luxury building 15 minutes across town. Robert made a decision that would change everything. He instructed the driver to take him to the luxury building instead. The Sukhumvit Tower was everything the investigator's report had described. Glass and steel, reaching toward the clouds. Doormen in crisp uniforms. Luxury cars in the circular drive. This was not the modest building Siriporn had shown him in carefully cropped photos. This was the kind of place where young women lived when older foreign men were paying their expenses. Robert approached the front desk with a confidence he didn't feel. "I'm here to see Siriporn Kantawong," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. The desk clerk checked his computer and nodded. "Apartment 407. Shall I call up to announce you?" "No," Robert said quickly. "I want to surprise her." The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt like ascending to his own execution. Each floor that passed was another layer of deception being peeled away. Another confirmation that the woman he had loved, had planned to marry, had given his life savings to, was nothing like who she had claimed to be. He stood outside apartment 407 for several minutes, listening to the sounds within. Music was playing, Western pop songs that Siriporn had never mentioned enjoying. Voices, multiple voices, laughing and talking in a mixture of Thai and English. The smell of expensive takeout food drifted under the door. When Robert finally knocked, The voices inside went quiet. Footsteps approached the door, and he heard the peephole cover slide open. Then silence. Long, heavy silence. "Siripon," he called softly. "It's Robert. I wanted to surprise you." More silence. Then frantic whispering in Thai. Then the sound of people moving quickly. Chairs scraping. What sounded like someone leaving through another door. When the door finally opened, Siripon stood there, wearing an expression Robert had never seen before. Gone was the warm smile, the joy that lit up her face during their video calls. Instead, she looked trapped, angry, calculating. She was dressed in clothes he had never seen her wear. Expensive designer pieces that cost more than the monthly allowance he had been sending her for food and necessities. Her hair was professionally styled, her makeup perfect, her nails done at a salon that charged more for a single appointment than she had claimed to spend on groceries in a week. "Robert," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "You're early?" Behind her, the apartment was nothing like the modest space she had shown him. Leather furniture, a massive television, artwork on the walls, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view that must have cost a fortune. The kitchen was equipped with appliances that cost more than many people's cars. "I can see that," Robert replied, stepping past her into the apartment. "Nice place. Very different from the photos you've been sending me." Siripon closed the door and leaned against it, her arms crossed. The woman who had spent 18 months telling him she loved him, who had cried with gratitude for his help, who had promised him a future together, was nowhere to be found. In her place stood a stranger, cold and defensive. "How did you find me?" she asked. "I hired someone to verify your story before I proposed," Robert said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Imagine my surprise when I learned that my future wife, the medical student I've been supporting, doesn't actually exist." For a moment, something flickered across Siripon's face. It might have been shame or fear or regret, but it passed quickly, replaced by defiance. "You hired a private investigator to spy on me," she demanded, as if his lack of trust was the real betrayal here. Robert laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I hired someone to confirm that the woman I was planning to marry was who she said she was. Call me old-fashioned, but I thought that was reasonable before relocating my entire life to Thailand." "I never asked you to relocate anywhere," Siripon shot back. "I never asked you to come here at all." "No, you just asked me for $60,000 to pay for medical school," Robert replied. "Medical school you're not attending, to become a doctor you never intended to be, to help people you've never cared about." The next few hours unfolded like a nightmare Robert couldn't wake up from. What he had expected to be a confrontation, followed by explanation, apology, perhaps even a path to redemption, instead became a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Siripon didn't deny the deception. Instead, she reframed it. She had never explicitly said she was in medical school, she claimed. Robert had assumed that, had projected his own needs and fantasies onto their conversations. She had simply shared her dreams, her hopes for the future, and he had misinterpreted them as current reality. When Robert produced printouts of their messages, clear statements where she described her current classes, her clinical rotations, her professors, Siripon pivoted. She had been planning to enroll in medical school, she said. The money he sent was helping her prepare for that eventual enrollment. She had been studying independently, taking prerequisite courses, building toward her goal. When Robert showed her photos of herself at nightclubs while claiming to be studying in libraries, she became angry. How dare he spy on her? How dare he judge how she chose to relax after long days of preparation? Everyone needed to unwind, to socialize, to have some enjoyment in their lives. But the most devastating manipulation came when Robert asked about the other men in the photographs. Siripon looked him directly in the eyes and told him they were study partners, fellow pre-med students, friends who were helping her navigate the complex medical school application process. The expensive clothes were gifts from generous friends. The jewelry was borrowed for special occasions. The luxury apartment belonged to a roommate whose family was wealthy. For every piece of evidence Robert presented, Siripon had an explanation that sounded reasonable if you wanted to believe it. If you were desperate to salvage a relationship you had invested everything in. She was skilled at this, Robert realized. He was not her first victim, and he wouldn't be her last. But the moment that shattered Robert's last vestige of hope came when Siripon's phone buzzed with a message. Without thinking, she glanced at it, and her face lit up with the smile Robert had thought was reserved for him. The same warm, loving expression she made during their video calls. The look that had convinced him she was the woman he would spend the rest of his life with. The message was from another man, someone named Michael, asking if she could meet him for dinner tonight, because he was arriving from Australia with a gift for her. Robert had seen that look too many times in their video calls to be mistaken about what it meant. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She was doing to Michael exactly what she had been doing to him, probably to multiple men, simultaneously, all convinced they were in exclusive relationships with a struggling medical student who needed their help to achieve her dreams. "How many of us are there?" Robert asked quietly. Siripon's mask finally slipped completely. The sweet, grateful woman disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating. "Does it matter?" she said. "You got what you wanted from this arrangement. You felt needed, important, like a hero. You weren't really helping me, Robert. You were helping yourself feel better about your dead wife." The cruelty of that statement, the way she weaponized his grief against him, revealed the true depths of her manipulation. She had studied him, learned his vulnerabilities, and used his love for his deceased wife as a tool to extract money from him. Robert felt something break inside him that had nothing to do with heartbreak and everything to do with rage. This woman had stolen more than his money. She had stolen 18 months of his healing process, had exploited his grief for profit, had made him complicit in her deception of other lonely, vulnerable men. That night, alone in his hotel room, Robert made a decision that would define the rest of his time in Bangkok. He could leave, accept the loss, and try to move on, or he could fight back, not just for himself, but for Michael from Australia and whoever else was currently being deceived by Siripon's elaborate fiction. Robert chose to fight, but what happened next would test everything he thought he knew about justice, revenge, and his own moral boundaries. He started by reaching out to the private investigator, asking for more detailed information about Siripon's activities and associates. What he learned painted a picture of a sophisticated operation that went far beyond one woman scamming lonely foreigners. Siripon was part of a network, the investigator explained. Multiple young Thai women, all with similar stories of educational or family hardships, all connected to the same expensive apartment building, all working with the same supporting cast of friends who helped create the illusion of legitimate need. They had fake university identification cards, borrowed medical textbooks for photo opportunities, access to hospital facilities, through accomplices who actually worked there. They shared photographs and locations, recycling the same props and backgrounds for different victims. What Robert had believed was his unique relationship with Siripon was actually a template reproduced for multiple men simultaneously. The investigator had identified at least 6 men currently sending money to women in this network. Engineers from Germany, retirees from America, divorced businessmen from Japan and Australia, all convinced they were in exclusive relationships with women who needed their help to achieve dreams that existed only in carefully crafted fiction. Robert realized he had 2 choices. He could expose the entire network, potentially saving other victims, but also destroying any chance of recovering his money. Or he could try to get his money back first, then expose them. He chose the first option, but not for altruistic reasons. Robert had spent his career as an architect, building things that would last, creating structures that served purposes beyond his own immediate needs. The idea of allowing this network to continue operating while he focused solely on his own financial recovery felt like a betrayal of everything he had tried to build in his life. Working with the investigator, Robert began documenting everything. They photographed the luxury apartment building, tracked the movements of multiple women involved in the network, identified the men currently being victimized. They gathered evidence of fake university enrollments, documented the use of borrowed credentials, and staged photographs. But as they dug deeper, Robert began to uncover aspects of the operation that were darker than simple financial fraud. Some of the men being victimized were sending amounts that represented their entire life savings. One German engineer had mortgaged his house to pay for his girlfriend's medical school tuition. A retired American teacher was working extra shifts at a part-time job to send money for his fiancée's sick mother. The network wasn't just stealing money. They were destroying lives, exploiting the deepest human need for connection and love, turning the desire to help others into a weapon against their victims. Robert's righteous anger was tempered by a growing understanding of his own complicity. He had wanted to believe Siripon's story because it made him feel needed, important, heroic. He had ignored red flags because acknowledging them would have meant admitting that his judgment was impaired by grief and loneliness. Every man being victimized by this network had made the same choice Robert had made: to believe what they wanted to believe, to ignore warning signs because the alternative was returning to the loneliness they were trying to escape. This realization didn't excuse Siripon and her associates, but it complicated Robert's feelings about his role as both victim and willing participant. He had sent money not just because he was deceived, but because being deceived felt better than being alone. The breakthrough came when the investigator traced financial records showing that the network was laundering money through multiple accounts, converting the funds sent by foreign victims into legitimate investments and business ventures. This wasn't just fraud. It was organized money laundering on an international scale. Armed with this evidence, Robert faced his final choice. He could take everything to Thai authorities and international law enforcement agencies, potentially dismantling the entire network, but also ensuring he would never see a penny of his money again. Or he could confront Siripon directly, attempt to negotiate the return of some funds in exchange for his silence. Robert chose confrontation, but not for the money. He realized that he needed to face Siripon one more time, not as a victim seeking revenge, but as someone who had learned something essential about himself and wanted to understand how he had allowed himself to be manipulated so completely. The second meeting took place at Siriporn's apartment, but this time Robert brought the investigators' full report. Faced with evidence of the larger network, of the money laundering operation, of the multiple victims, Siriporn's demeanor changed completely. Gone was the defiance from their first confrontation. Instead, Robert found himself sitting across from a young woman who looked genuinely frightened for the first time since he had known her. "You don't understand," she said. And for the first time in their entire relationship, Robert believed she was telling him the truth. "This isn't something I can just stop. There are people involved who won't let me walk away." What Robert learned in that conversation changed everything he thought he understood about his situation. Siriporn wasn't the mastermind of this operation. She was, in her own way, as trapped as the men she was deceiving. The network was controlled by individuals who used a combination of financial incentives and threats to ensure compliance. Young women like Siriporn were recruited with promises of easy money and luxurious lifestyles. But once they were involved, leaving became increasingly difficult. They were required to maintain multiple simultaneous relationships, meet monthly quotas for money extracted from victims, and surrender a significant percentage of their earnings to the network operators. Failure to comply resulted in threats against family members, public exposure of their activities, and, according to Siriporn, occasionally physical violence. Robert realized that his quest for justice had uncovered something much larger and more dangerous than simple romance fraud. He was looking at a sophisticated criminal organization that victimized both the foreign men who sent money and the young women who were coerced into extracting it. This revelation forced Robert to reconfront his understanding of Siriporn. She was still responsible for her choices, still complicit in the deception that had cost him $60,000 and 18 months of his life. But she was also, in some ways, a victim herself, trapped in a system designed to exploit both her circumstances and the loneliness of men like Robert. The question became, what was Robert going to do with this knowledge? Working with the investigator and eventually with Thai law enforcement agencies, Robert spent the next 2 weeks in Bangkok helping to document and expose the entire network. The operation was more extensive than anyone had initially realized, involving dozens of young women and hundreds of victims across multiple countries. Robert's case became part of a larger investigation that would eventually shut down the network and result in arrests of the organizers. But the process also meant that Robert had to relive his deception in police interviews, court filings, and eventually media coverage that portrayed him as both a victim and a cautionary tale. The hardest part wasn't the public embarrassment or the financial loss. It was confronting the depth of his own need that had made the deception possible. Robert had to acknowledge that he had sent $60,000 to someone he had never met, not just because he was deceived, but because he desperately wanted to believe he could find love and purpose again after Sarah's death. Siriporn was arrested along with dozens of others involved in the network. During the legal proceedings, she provided testimony that helped authorities understand the scope of the operation and identify additional victims. But she also faced charges for her role in the fraud, charges that would likely result in years in prison. Robert found himself in the strange position of feeling both vindicated and sympathetic toward the woman who had deceived him. Justice was being served, the network was being dismantled, other potential victims were being protected, but Siriporn, despite her crimes, was also paying a price for decisions made under coercion and circumstances that Robert couldn't fully understand. The legal proceedings took months to resolve. During that time, Robert remained in Bangkok, working with authorities, providing testimony, helping to identify other victims. It was a process that forced him to examine not just Siriporn's deception, but his own motivations, his grief process, and his readiness to move forward with his life. 6 months after arriving in Bangkok expecting to propose marriage, Robert found himself on a plane back to Toronto, carrying legal documents instead of wedding plans, having lost most of his savings, but having gained something he hadn't expected: clarity about himself and what he actually needed to heal from Sarah's death. The money was gone, almost all of it. Some would be recovered through asset forfeiture as part of the criminal case. But Robert knew he would never see most of the $60,000 he had sent to Siriporn. His retirement plans were drastically altered, his financial security compromised, his trust in his own judgment shaken. But Robert had also learned something valuable about the difference between healing and hiding, between processing grief and avoiding it, between genuine connection and the illusion of connection that comes from being needed by someone who doesn't actually exist. The months following his return to Toronto were difficult in ways that Robert hadn't anticipated. The financial stress was manageable. He adjusted his lifestyle, delayed his retirement plans, picked up additional consulting work. The bigger challenge was rebuilding his sense of himself as someone capable of making good decisions about relationships. Robert began seeing a grief counselor, something he had resisted after Sarah's death, but now realized he desperately needed. He joined support groups for people who had experienced financial fraud, discovering that his story, while unique in its details, was part of a larger pattern of exploitation that targeted people during vulnerable periods of their lives. Slowly, carefully, Robert began to rebuild his life in Toronto. He reconnected with friends he had neglected during his 18-month relationship with Siriporn. He threw himself into work projects that reminded him of his skills and value as an architect. He volunteered with organizations that helped other fraud victims, using his experience to educate people about the warning signs he had missed. Most importantly, Robert began the actual process of grieving Sarah's death, something he realized he had been avoiding by focusing on his relationship with Siriporn. The woman he had loved online was, in many ways, a projection of his desire to find someone who needed him the way Sarah had, someone whose dreams he could support the way he had supported hers. The healing process was slow and sometimes painful. Robert had to confront not just the loss of Sarah, but his own role in avoiding that grief by jumping into a relationship that felt safer because it was conducted entirely through screens and messages. He had to acknowledge his own vulnerability and loneliness without shame, understanding that these were normal responses to loss, not character flaws to be hidden. As the legal case in Thailand concluded with convictions for the network operators and suspended sentences for some of the young women who cooperated with authorities, Robert received updates about Siriporn. She had served 6 months in Thai prison, then been released on probation with requirements to perform community service and regular check-ins with social workers. According to the investigator, Siriporn had returned to her family's village outside Bangkok and was working in her uncle's restaurant while attending evening classes to earn legitimate credentials for university admission. Whether this represented genuine reform or simply a strategic choice to avoid further legal problems, Robert would never know. But the update forced him to confront his lingering feelings about Siriporn herself. Despite everything she had done, despite the elaborate deception and the financial devastation, Robert found that his anger toward her had faded into something more complex. Sadness for the circumstances that had led her into the network. Recognition of the limited choices available to young women in her situation, and acknowledgement that their entire relationship, while built on lies, had served psychological needs for both of them. This wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a form of understanding that allowed Robert to move forward without carrying the burden of hatred or the fantasy of revenge. 2 years after returning from Bangkok, Robert met Eleanor at a community center where he was teaching a workshop on financial fraud prevention. Eleanor was a widow herself, someone who had lost her husband to a heart attack 3 years earlier and was slowly rebuilding her own life. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, based on shared experiences and genuine compatibility, rather than psychological need or the desire to rescue or be rescued. Robert found himself able to talk about Sarah naturally, without guilt, and to listen to Eleanor's memories of her husband without feeling threatened or competing with a ghost. When Robert finally felt ready to consider a serious commitment again, he approached it differently than he had approached his online relationship with Siriporn. He and Elena had been friends for months, had met each other's families, had navigated conflicts and disagreements, had seen each other during difficult times and celebrations. Their relationship was built on knowledge rather than fantasy, on compatibility rather than need, on genuine affection rather than the projection of desires onto a carefully crafted persona. The engagement ring Robert bought for Elena was different from the one he had planned to give Siriporn. Simpler, more personal, chosen based on Elena's actual preferences, rather than his assumptions about what a grateful young woman might want from an older man trying to recapture lost love. As Robert prepared to start this new chapter of his life, he reflected on the lessons learned from his devastating experience with Siriporn and the network that had exploited both of them. The financial cost had been enormous, but the educational value was perhaps even greater. He had learned to recognize the difference between love and need, between helping someone and helping himself feel important, between genuine connection and the attractive illusion of being someone's hero. He had learned that grief requires actual processing, not avoidance through distraction or rescue fantasies. Most importantly, Robert had learned that vulnerability is not weakness, that acknowledging loneliness is not shameful, and that the desire for connection is both fundamental to human nature and potentially dangerous when it's not balanced with wisdom and self-awareness. The story that began with Robert standing outside Bangkok's airport, devastated by photographic evidence of Siriporn's deception, ended with him standing at the altar of a small church in Toronto, marrying a woman who knew him completely, flaws and strengths alike, and loved him not because he could solve her problems, but because they could face life's challenges together. But this ending, happy as it was, came with a responsibility that Robert took seriously. His experience had taught him something about the epidemic of loneliness and exploitation that preys on people during their most vulnerable moments. He knew that for every story like his that ended in recovery and new love, there were countless others that ended in financial ruin, emotional devastation, and lost faith in the possibility of genuine human connection. That's why Robert continued his volunteer work with fraud prevention organizations, why he spoke at community centers and senior centers about the warning signs he had missed, why he shared his story despite the embarrassment and judgment it sometimes brought. Because the truth about romance fraud isn't just about individual victims and criminals. It's about a society where loneliness is so pervasive and genuine connection so difficult to find that millions of people are willing to send money to strangers on the internet in exchange for the feeling of being needed and loved. Robert's story is both a cautionary tale about the dangers of online romance and a testament to the possibility of recovery, growth, and genuine love after devastating betrayal. It's a reminder that our deepest needs, while beautiful and fundamentally human, can also be our greatest vulnerabilities when we're not honest with ourselves about what we're really seeking. The $60,000 Robert lost to Siriporn's network represented more than money. It represented his attempt to purchase meaning, purpose, and love during a period when grief had made him desperate for all three. The lesson wasn't that he shouldn't have sought connection after Sarah's death, but that real connection requires honesty, vulnerability, and the willingness to be known completely, not just to be needed. As Robert learned, there's a profound difference between being someone's hero and being someone's partner. Heroes save people, partners grow together. Heroes are needed, partners are chosen. Heroes fulfill fantasies, partners share reality. The network that exploited Robert and hundreds of other men understood this difference and weaponized it, offering the fantasy of being a hero while extracting payment for that illusion. The young women involved in the network, whether willingly or under coercion, became expert at performing need, gratitude, and admiration that felt real because it was exactly what their victims wanted to experience. But real love, as Robert learned with Eleanor, is messier and more complex than the carefully managed relationship he had experienced with Siriporn. Real love involves seeing and accepting flaws, navigating disagreements, sharing mundane daily experiences that can't be edited or staged. Real love is built on knowledge rather than projection, on compatibility rather than rescue fantasies. If you're watching this story and recognizing elements of your own experience, if you found yourself in relationships that seem too good to be true or too perfectly aligned with your psychological needs, take Robert's journey as both warning and hope. Warning that our deepest desires can be exploited by those who understand how to perform what we think we want. Hope that recovery, growth, and genuine love are possible even after devastating betrayal. The internet has created unprecedented opportunities for connection, but also for deception. The same technologies that allow us to find compatible partners across the globe also allow skilled manipulators to study our vulnerabilities and construct elaborate personas designed to exploit them. Robert's story reminds us that the best defense against such exploitation isn't cynicism or withdrawal from seeking connection, but rather self-awareness, honest examination of our own needs and motivations, and the patience to build relationships based on genuine knowledge rather than attractive fantasy. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like Robert's. Stories that reveal both the darkness and light of human nature, the dangers and possibilities of seeking love in a complex world. Leave a comment sharing your own experiences or thoughts about the lessons from Robert's journey. And remember, the goal isn't to avoid all risk in relationships, but to approach them with wisdom, honesty, and realistic expectations about what love actually looks like when it's real. These stories matter because they remind us that we're all vulnerable to exploitation when we're lonely, grieving, or desperately seeking meaning and connection. But they also remind us that vulnerability can be a strength when it's balanced with wisdom, that the courage to seek love after loss is admirable even when it leads us astray, and that the human capacity for recovery, growth, and genuine connection is stronger than the forces that seek to exploit it. Robert's story began with deception and loss, but ended with wisdom and love, not because he was lucky, but because he chose to learn from his experience rather than be defined by it, to seek genuine connection rather than settle for attractive illusion, and to approach new relationships with both hope and hard-won wisdom about the difference between being needed and being loved.